You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to Middle East Monitor Live, Conversations Live. My name is Osman Butt. I'm a video producer with MEMO. My guest today is Murtaza Hussain. Murtaza is a reporter at the Intercept who focuses on national security and foreign policy. He has appeared on CNN, BBC, and MSNBC, and other news outlets. Murtaza, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
Could you please tell us about how you got involved with journalism? What led you to want to be working on things like foreign policy, national security issues in particular?
Yeah, it's funny. I always wanted to be a journalist growing up. I didn't study it formally. I just kind of got into it on my own. I was freelancing for many years. I went to Egypt around the time of the Arab Spring and started writing about it a little bit there in earnest. And then other places, Tunisia, I was traveling around the region, took an interest in it, was just doing it for my own edification, to be honest. But then later on, I started writing for a few publications in the US and the Middle East. And then over time, I ended up getting into full time. And then through the auspices of that in 2013, I started working for the Intercept, which is a new publication at that time. And to this day, I'm there writing about national security and related issues. It's been almost a decade now.
What would you say was your, how would you say describe your experiences of trying to do all of this stuff?
It's interesting. It's very labor intensive sometimes. Sometimes you have to deal with documents or sources who are secret, so we have to learn how to security and things like that are very important. Reporting can be very rewarding, can be very enjoyable and edifying. It's a lot of challenges as well too. It's good having a team to help you and having good editors and things like that for support. But I find that it's been a great experience. I'm still doing it today, and still many stories to report in the years to come, hopefully.
And speaking of the many stories, you recently wrote an article which was on Canadian citizens or who are dual nationals. So they are also Iranian, have Iranian citizenships. And in Iran, as some of our audience might already know, you're sort of required to do military service in Iran. So many people who are Canadian citizens, but also have Iranian citizenships, which your article sort of outlines, they have to go and serve in the IRGC, or the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, which is obviously, one of Iran's military. But in 2019, the Trump administration designated the IGC a terrorist organization, which had a profound impact on dual nationals. And so my sort of first question here then is, first of all, how did you actually come across this story to begin with?
Yeah, someone reached out to me and told me that they were having this issue. They were a Canadian citizen and said there's dozens of people like him in Canada and in Europe and Australia and other countries too, who were Iranian nationals originally growing up. And as you said, Iran has mandatory conscription, and the IRGC is actually a major branch of the Iranian military. It has maybe up to 200,000 recruits at any given time. So it's a very common experience for young Iranian men to be randomly drafted to the IRGC. And these men who had been drafted in their youth, and now some of them are in their 50s or even older than that, they now today are on the terrorist watch list in the US if they disclose at the time of their immigration to Canada or wherever else that they'd served in the IRGC, which is a question they ask you when you immigrate. They ask if you've done military service in your country of origin, and if so, what unit. People were honest about it for the most part because they had nothing to hide. There was nothing wrong with serving the IRGC from a legal standpoint until Trump designated the group in 2019. And now, retroactively, these people are considered terrorists. Even other people who are drafted to the organization today in Iran, whether they like the Iranian government or not, they don't really have a choice. They have to serve, you're conscripted like any other country. They now are potentially on this watch list. They can't travel, they can't immigrate. And there are many more serious consequences probably coming down the pipe for people on this list. And, it's a bit strange because we've never really had a national military designated before as a terrorist organization for quite good reason that, we don't tend to consider states to be terrorists, even if we don't like them. And secondly, that a lot of states have conscription. And if you're designating members of a organization that has conscription as terrorists, then you're going to end up putting a lot of people on the terrorist watch list who are not actually security threats to the United States or anybody else. They're just conscripts doing their mandatory service as young men and then trying to move on with their lives. And it's a bit troubling for Western citizens too, because you expect when you immigrate to a new country and build life there, you get citizenship, you have the full rights afforded to other citizens. But as we can see, this is creating effectively a two-tiered system of citizenship in many Western countries, because people are being blamed and held accountable for things which are in their countries they're born in and are very, very, very much outside of their control.
Yes, and how many people with Western passports, or even just from Canada, do we think is affected by this?
I spoke to several dozen people myself, many, many people that I was in contact with myself, but I think there are far more, because there are a lot of people, I didn't speak to who are out there. There are, Signal and Telegram groups with hundreds of people in them in some cases talking about this. And just by the numbers, if you look at how many people the IRGC has at any given time, has, somewhere anywhere between 160 to 200,000 people. 160, 190,000, let's say, in given time, the highest estimates I've seen. And, people serve for maybe 18 months or 2 years in mandatory service, and then it rotates another group of people in and out. So you have really a huge number of people who are former members of the IRGC at any given time. Many people are very educated. The IRGC likes to target people for recruitment who are engineers and things like that, people who are very good candidates for immigration. So I really do estimate that there are many, many more people, maybe talking in Western countries, could be tens of thousands of people affected by this, and in other countries too. Maybe millions of people served in the IRGC potentially since the Iranian Revolution a few decades ago. So you're talking about a very tremendous number of people who potentially are on this list all around the world.
Yes, and could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about the experiences of people who were put on this list, or who found themselves unable to enter countries like the United States, for example?
Sure. Being on a terrorist watch list is very difficult. You're subject to detention every time you travel, at the minimum, interrogation or being stopped for hours and hours. That's to be expected. Unfortunately, many of these people, the Canadians I focused on, traveling to the US, if you live in Canada, it's very, very much part of having a job generally, or just living a normal life, entails a lot of cross-border travel. I believe 90% of the Canadian population lives within about an hour drive from the US border. It's very, very economically dependent on the US. So suddenly you can't travel to the US for this unexplained reason. You can't really do a lot of jobs. You can't do many of the jobs which are more desirable than the people who have built their lives and their families around doing. So they can't do that. But more than that, the US does information sharing with other countries, allied countries, about who are on their watch list. So people have been detained and barred from entering Mexico. They've been detained while traveling to the EU. They've been detained while transiting on flights towards Iran and from other countries. So there's a lot of fear. You just kind of a bit unnerving to not know what other governments around the world have been told about you. You could travel to a country where the human rights situation is very bad, but it's a US intelligence partner. You could be detained and subject to much worse abuse in that sense if they have gotten the information that you're quote unquote a terrorist. So generally, it's a lot of paranoia. A lot of people are afraid of their bank accounts being frozen as well too, because there's not really any maximum level of repression that you could suffer. It seems like if you're on a watch list, which equates you with, groups like Al Qaeda or ISIS and things like that, well, there's like a pretty high bar for the level of scrutiny and attention, negative attention that people on that list for those organizations could receive. So, a lot of these guys are very worried. They're very worried. They can't really, live normally. They can't have expectations of a normal economic life. They don't know what their civil liberties are going to look like 2 years from now. It's a very unnerving situation, mostly so because they have no way of disproving or proving that they're not a threat or trying to fight back against this. They're held hostage to political circumstances well beyond their control.
Yes, and what do you think was the purpose of the Trump administration to do to place the IRGC onto the terrorism list, because obviously other US administrations didn't feel the need to do this. So what do you think was that the Trump administration was trying to achieve by this?
I think it was a political move. It was aimed at the Trump administration is very close to the Israeli government and some of the Gulf Arab governments, and they were giving them pretty much everything they wanted in Middle East policy. They were delivering them very, very enthusiastically pro-Israel and pro-Gulf Arab, Saudi and Emirati policy in this case. So, they're hostile to Iran. So let's give them a very great symbolic addition to that general hostility by designating the IRGC as a terrorist group. So, okay, that was a very significant move. As you said, no one's really done that before. And the reason that it's a bit tricky to designate a military of a state as a terrorist organization. But also, I do think that there was an intention to enshrine hostility in law between Iran and the US. It makes it harder to do negotiations in general. It makes it harder for a future administration which wanted to have talks with Iran to have talks. And now, as we're seeing today, this issue of the IRGC delisting has become the major remaining stumbling block to reviving the Iran nuclear agreement. That agreement's already been very weakened, and it's a shell of its former self. But despite that, there's some benefit which could be had of having an agreement to avoid a conflict over the nuclear program, and from Iran's perspective, having some economic relief from sanctions. But they can't get past this because this IRGC listing issue is such a huge problem that the Iranians are asking for it to be lifted before any deal is reached, and the US is not willing to do so, even under Biden. I think because Biden's afraid that the Republicans will make a big issue out of this in the midterm elections if he were to do so. So it's a bit of a poison pill for any future negotiations, and it's functioning quite effectively in that regard.
Could you perhaps tell us then what the terrorism designation, how has it impacted the activities of the IGC itself, as well as the overall impact on Iran itself?
It doesn't seem to have impacted the IRGC that much because the IRGC is already sanctioned and Iran is sanctioned as a state sponsor of terror. It's much more symbolic. I think at an organizational level, we haven't seen any changes in their behavior or their external operations, which is run by a subset of the IRGC called the Quds Force. The IRGC is very involved in Iran's economy and Iran's infrastructure. Since Iran came under sanctions, you could say in the 80s, 90s, of heavy sanctions, it's taken up a role that the private sector would take in other countries. It administers airports, other infrastructure. It's a very important player in the Iranian economy, and it remains that in that way, regardless of sanctions or this listing. It has affected ordinary Iranians quite a bit who, hope to travel or study abroad. Like many of them do, many of the most talented people in Iran would like to travel outside of Iran, at least for trips or for studying or to live abroad. And if they get drafted to the IRGC, if they're a young man, and they don't really have any control over that, they can't do any of those things. So it's created it's harmed a lot of innocent people, but not really done much to the IRGC as an organization.
Yes, and the IRGC is still able to move quite freely throughout the Middle East, especially. They don't seem to have done as well outside the Middle East, but within the region, they're still able to carry out activities in Iraq. A few months ago, they carried out airstrikes inside northern Iraq. And I remember actually with the Intercept, you actually guys about 2 years ago published some internal documents from Iranian intelligence, which was detailing IGC activities inside Iraq. And they're very, very deeply involved, if I remember correctly from those documents.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a lot of influence and control over Iraq, heavily involved on the ground there. I don't think that this terrorist designation has changed that at all. There's no reason for it to change it. In some sense, they run Iraq. They run Iraq in a very important way. They have a lot of the most important politicians on their side. They have a lot of freedom of movement there. And for them, this is they have a very long history from the Iranian Revolution. They were fought against Iraq. Many of the people who were senior officers in the IRGC fought in the Iran-Iraq war. And for them, this is like the victory of that war, the fact that they can travel freely in Iraq and visit Karbala and these places which have religious significance to them. So they're not going to sacrifice that. They haven't sacrificed that. And the sanctions or terrorist listing is not very relevant to them in that regard.
Yes. So moving changing pace slightly, although not necessarily less intense. In the West, the media has projected a united front, at least in the media, against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. But many states in the Middle East and Asia have either not joined the sanctions or have been very restrained in their criticism of Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. Why do you think this is, and what does it tell us about the future of world politics?
Yeah, right. So I think the countries like, India and China and so forth, obviously they've seen a lot of economic development and political ascendancy in the last few decades, and they're more confident and they don't feel the need to go along with what the Western powers see as a big emergency at the time. I feel like during World War II, the situation was very different. A lot of these countries were colonial possessions, literally. They had to get involved in all these European conflicts. A lot of Indians, for instance, died in the World Wars, not to any great effect. But there's a lot of resentment for that. There's a lot of a desire for independence, and it's not to say these countries are good or necessarily have good human rights records on their own, but they certainly are embracing the possibility of greater foreign policy independence. They don't want to follow what the U.S. says. I do think that in this case there's a strong case to be made morally that one should take a stance against Russia, against aggression in Ukraine in this conflict. But at the same time, they have their own interests. They have India, for instance, has really extensive military and economic ties with Russia. China is the same. And they have no interest in being part of a coalition against Russia that negates or ignores their own particular interests. We're even seeing some European countries that continue buying gas from Russia and want to continue doing so for quite some time. So reasonably, Asian and African countries are asking, well, if you're continuing having a trade with them, why are you lecturing us or telling us not to? And I think we're going to see more of that, more independence in the years ahead. It won't necessarily make the world better, per se. It will just be different. It'll be different. It'll be different configuration of power. And I wouldn't say it's a fully multipolar world, but certainly you see a world where there's a lot more latitude for large non-Western countries to determine an independent foreign policy.
Yes, it's quite interesting to watch the different reactions. I mean, I think partly it's about the US, this perception that the US at least is pulling back a little bit from the world. I think that's sort of playing a role here. But it's also interesting to watch what happened in Pakistan recently, where you had Imran Khan, who was obviously, he flew into Moscow the day of the invasion, which, maybe you could read that as an omen of his ill-fated political career coming to an end. But then you had the Pakistani army rebuking him a little bit later after he had fallen.
Yeah, it's interesting. Imran Khan has claimed that his removal was due to U.S. Engineering of a coup, so to speak, in Pakistan. I'm not totally sure about that, but I do think that the timing was very indicative, perhaps, of fierce divisions inside the Pakistani establishment between people who prefer to have close ties with the West and those who would like to take a more independent foreign policy the way India has. Pakistani military has historically been very close to the US. I'm sure they were antagonized by this visit. They had already been a bit antagonized by what they perceive as an anti-American streak in Imran Khan. I think, unfortunately, Pakistan does not have the economic power to have an independent foreign policy today. The basis of India's relative independence, which Imran Khan talked about, in fact, it has been the relative economic ascendancy they've experienced in the last few decades. And until Pakistan can replicate that in some sense, they will probably be dependent for needing to seek out relatively good ties with the US and with other Western countries, regardless of the context, because they need to have good trade ties with them. They receive military support from them in many ways. And it'd be very difficult to replace that or to go without that. So, it was a very interesting sequence of events. And, one cannot say for sure what took place absent any strong evidence. I think extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but certainly was a conspicuous timing between his visit to Moscow and his removal from power with the apparent connivance or at least support of the Pakistani military just a few weeks later.
We've also seen Middle Eastern states as well get quite involved. I mean, there was a report in The Guardian about 2 weeks ago about Iraqi militia supplying weapons to the Russians via Iran. And the claim was that obviously Russia needs these weapons because it's suddenly sanctioned. And so even though Russia is one of the largest arms producers in the world, it doesn't necessarily have all the parts to mass produce weaponry. And the general feeling is that for Iran's perspective, they don't want Russia to lose. And so thinking about that, what would the impact of a Russian victory or defeat be on the Middle East itself?
I hadn't actually seen that report, but that's interesting. I'm a little skeptical about some of the reports that have been going around about the level of support or recruiting that Russia is doing in the Middle East and how impactful it has been on Ukraine today. It's certainly possible something that could happen. And, I don't know. It's like, I don't think that I suspect there's not going to be a clear outcome of the war. I don't think there'll be a clear victory or defeat. I think Russia will do things, even if they can't achieve their goals of deposing the government or even changing the status quo in Ukraine. I think that they will do things to try to save face. They may use tactical nuclear weapons against a Ukrainian target at some point if they can't do anything else. There will be some sort of politically ambiguous ending to the war that all sides will try to engineer. I think that I think the most important issue actually is disruption of trade and the removal of Ukraine and Russia from international trade flows, or systems like SWIFT, which allow trade with Russia, for instance. I think that'll have the greater impact on than anything political on the Middle East, because the major importers of Ukrainian and Russian wheat are in the Middle East, and other trade ties exist there too. If those are disrupted for a long period of time, we're going to see an increase of price. We're going to see a lot of disruption. So I think that unfortunately, that's more likely to be how people experience whatever happens in this conflict, more so than any grander political reconfiguration, which I think is still not imminent.
So moving away from this conflict, as you've already alluded to, we're not quite in a multipolar world, and I would agree. And it may not be the case that we enter into a multipolar world per se, but we are heading towards a world where regional powers will have greater influence or say over how things work in at least their part of the world. So thinking forward and into the future, as far as we are able to, what do we think the future of the Middle East is going to look like in this sort of more latitudinal world?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. It really depends. It depends whether Saudi Arabia and Iran, the proxy war comes to an end, the relationship between Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and even Israel, what political configuration comes about there. I think you're probably going to see a normalization of the Syrian government in the coming years. The UAE has already reached out to them and publicly embraced them as well too. I think that's a sign of where this is going. So, it depends. I think that the real issues in the Middle East are going to be ecological, economic, and demographic, and the political configurations will be driven from those. I don't think there's any real vision or it's not a situation like China where they're economically empowered and now they're making ideological decisions. I think that the hard facts of raw materials access and livability and demographics are going to determine what politics are downstream from there. And hopefully those things turn out okay, but there are very serious challenges ahead, I think, in the years to come.
Yes, and we've seen, of course, in the region this move towards, say, normalization of Israel, which is maybe something else that's going to happen more and more in the future.
Yeah, I think definitely you're going to see more states normalize with Israel in the years to come. The UAE usually is like a bellwether in some sense, or they're at least at the avant-garde they seek to be in terms of changing political configurations. Saudi Arabia has already said that they're interested in normalizing with Israel. Bahrain has done so as well too, of course. The other countries, I think that many of them are waiting for some concession from Israel, maybe towards the Palestinians to help make it a little bit more politically palatable. But, at some point, I think that the Israelis waited out the UAE. They might figure they can wait out Saudis and others without making any changes too, and that'll probably work. They have good ties with Turkey again now too. Turkish government embrace Israel once again after many years of rocky relations. I do think that that's probably where this is going. I think that they've going to agree to disagree about the Palestinians, and I think the public opinion will still be pretty complicated, pretty negative towards Israel as long as the conflict goes on. But I don't see that the states in the region are going to continue fighting Israel, with the one exception, seemingly, of Iran, unless the Iranian government changes. I think they're ideologically committed to a version of anti-colonialism, which entails fighting Israel to the end by their state ideology from the revolution. Other than that, I don't see any other country that has that sort of dispensation. I think that all of them can come to peace terms with Israel quite reasonably. And even if public opinion is not there yet, they are capable of pretty much ignoring that. And I think that the UAE is a good example, because the UAE did normalize the relations with Israel, and didn't just normalize it, embrace Israel very, very closely, much more so than Egypt ever did after it signed a peace treaty, or Jordan did. They're good friends now. But you don't see mass boycotts or protests internationally against the UAE. People seem to accept it. And I think other countries will see that, and they'll see, well, if this normalizing with Israel gives us strategic depth in Congress, in the US Congress, because it's a strong support of Israel, or it gives us access to tech or some other political benefit, a lot of them are going to do it. I can see that. You can see that the world is going that direction, and this Abraham Accords setup is being used as a framework to bring more countries in as well too. So I do think that that's where things are going, which is unfortunate from the Palestinian perspective, because they depend on international support. They've depended on it for many, many years as an equalizer or as a card in their pocket to play in negotiations with the Israelis about a future final status in the region.
And lastly, I want to ask you this, since you're obviously in the US and you do a lot of reporting on US foreign policy, what is the view from Washington about this so-called decline of the US and looking at the rest of the world? What is the future of all of this? How do they think of the future of this?
I think they're feeling pretty good these days now too, because they feel that they've shown that they're much militarily incomparable to Russia, and that they're, quote unquote, winning in the proxy war with Russia over Ukraine that now exists. So I think they're feeling more confident. I think they had a rough couple of years, bad wars in the Middle East. Afghanistan was a big humiliation. They're recovering, I think, and I think they're getting ready to confront China in the South China Sea. They're trying to get out of the Middle East in some sense, although they're having a hard time doing that. I think that there's a lot more wind in their sails than there was a year ago when the Afghanistan debacle was beginning to play out. So, it's not clear. I don't think that the US is done or gone, or even if it goes in relative decline, I don't think that will mean an absolute decline. I think they'll be a very strong and important player internationally for many years to come. In the Americas, probably indefinitely, and most likely in Europe and Asia as well too. So I think it's they're turning a corner, so to speak, because of what's happening in Ukraine, how horrible as it is. It's been good for, I think, the U.S. Security perspective. It's a chance to show that they're competent, they have good intel, and they can win wars despite decades of failures. So, I don't think they count the U.S. out at all. I think that just objectively speaking, I think that you're going to see, if there's a multipolar world or a world where power is more diffused, you're still going to see the U.S. as one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful player for many years to come.
Murtaza Hussain, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations. And to our audience, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in again next week for more MEMO Conversations Live.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.